Today we're going to fast forward from Psalm 8 all the way to Psalm 82. And I've been looking at some divine council stuff recently, partially because of the recent attacks on Michael Heiser's work. But even independently of that, I had just been looking at this stuff, so I figured I could put some things together and make a video out of this. As usual, I'll timestamp the video so you can jump around, and I'll make this PDF available so you can take a look at my notes on Ko-Fi. And also, I would like to note here in this document that I'll make available, here at the very end, I have something of an excursus on a number of different commentaries that take the supernatural view. So I put it here, appended at the very end. By no means is this exhaustive, but these are all the commentaries I had available, and it's by no means just Michael Heiser. In fact, I don't even list him among these commentators, but just so you know, it's there if you want to take a look at why I'm kind of presupposing the supernatural view, but we're going to argue for it as well. But let's just go ahead and jump in. Now, straight away, we're going to look at the date of composition. Now, Tate is going to point out that more or less, there's a pretty broad range. We go anywhere from the Davidic, Solomonic era all the way up to Maccabees, so we're spanning hundreds of years here. Mowinkle tied it to the New Year Festival, the Feast of Booths, Feast of Tabernacles, where Yahweh was celebrated, enthroned as the divine king. And so, of course, there are concepts related to that. Now, here Tate is going to say, however, that the psalm probably comes from a comparatively late time because of the connection between the idea of judgment and Yahweh's universal kingship. Now, I'm going to counter that by pointing out that this notion of Yahweh as, the universal king, as the God of the entire world, this idea that it's a late belief overlooks agreed upon early texts, such as Exodus 15, the Song of Moses, Psalm 29, where Yahweh is portrayed as the king of the gods, the king of the other Elohim, and is enthroned above the earth. So as we can see here in the Song of Moses, again, basically all commentators I know of say this is among the most ancient pieces of Hebrew poetry we have. And what is it saying? Who is like you, Yahweh, among the Elohim, among the gods? And also, similarly, Psalm 29 is considered very ancient, pre-exilic, ascribed to the Lord, O heavenly beings. And there it's B'nai Elohim. And here he's enthroned above the flood. He sits enthroned, that is, Yahweh sits enthroned forever. So why this is overlooked, I'm not really sure. But this idea that Yahweh here in Psalm 82 is being implored by the psalmist to arise, to judge the nations, inherit all the nations. You are king of the entire earth. The idea that that's a late invention, post-exilic, it's just not supported by the reality of what we do have. Now, Mowinkle's suggestion that it was part of the New Year Festival, commemorating Yahweh as the sovereign king of the gods, seems plausible. Psalms surrounding 82, such as 81 and 84, are also argued by Mowinkle to be part of this celebration. 81 and 84 share the same header with Psalm 8, which I have previously argued in my last video, also reflects the theme of God's sovereignty. Additionally, 2 Chronicles mentions that the Levites worshipped with the words of David and Asaph. And I'm alluding here specifically to 2 Chronicles 29, I think it's specifically 30, and this is Hezekiah, so this is hundreds of years after David. Hezekiah the king and the officials commanded the Levites to sing praises to the Lord with the words of David and of Asaph the seer. So what we're told here is that the Psalms of David and Asaph were part of the liturgy, the ancient liturgy before the exile. This is part of their worship, their temple worship, are these Psalms. So if we take this at face value, as I continue, this would suggest that the Psalms attributed to Asaph date to an early monarchy period, while any exilic material would have come from a later editorial layer. And I'm referring here to, for instance, Psalm 74. It's a psalm of Asaph, and you have a line in here about the enemy destroying the sanctuary, things like that. So it's like people will latch onto that and say, well, see, obviously that's post-exilic. It's like, yes, but, and in fact, even that psalm Psalm 74 has a lot of that divine warrior motif as we get down here, crushing the heads of the sea monsters, Leviathan, all that stuff. So this, I would argue, is back to Asaph. In any of this stuff that refers to the exile is probably some later editorial work. Now, to the structure of the psalm itself, some pretty interesting stuff going on here. So the psalm itself is 58 words, and it divides neatly into 26 words spoken by the prophet and 32 spoken by God. And here I have a chiasm that's color-coded here. But that, 26 and 32, gives us a Yahweh kavod formula. Kavod means glory. And so you have 26 plus 32 equals 58. 26 is Yahweh, the value of the divine name in ordinal value. 32 is kavod, glory, in decimal value. 58, the total number of words in the psalm, is also the numerical value of Most High. This is not the only psalm where Asaph incorporates 58 to the title Most High. That is Elyon. And we get, of course, that title here in verse 6. So Asaph also, he does this again, where he kind of encodes the number 58 and attaches it to one of these phrases referring to Yahweh as Elyon. And by the way, that's interesting because the 26 stuff, because 26, of course, the value of the divine name Yahweh. And as going to be noted by basically every commentator, Yahweh does not show up in the psalm. And this gets into, documentary hypothesis, all these different sources and stuff like that. The E source, the J source. And it is of note, again, Yahweh does not show up. However, his number is embedded throughout this psalm. And so that's rather interesting. But as we can see, the overall structure forms something of a menorah pattern and a chiasm. So in A, the prophet introduces God as judge. A prime, the prophet calls on God to judge. B, God charges the Elohim. B prime, God announces his verdict. C, God charges the Elohim. C prime, God considers their presumed status. And in the center, we have the prophet draw his conclusion. And so as you can see with the color-coded aspect of this, not just a chiasm, but also this menorah shape with the outside branches and the center branch being the words of the prophet. And this is out of Labuschagne's book, The Numerical Secrets of the Bible. And I didn't notice this straight away because, as you can see here, he has kind of a simpler chiasm here. The heavenly scene, verses 1 through 4, and the verses 5b through 8, the earthly scene, in each of which are 26 words. And then in the center, 5a, is the gods, the Elohim's failure to meet Yahweh's challenge. And it's this line, they have neither knowledge nor understanding. Now, I noticed this, but it didn't dawn on me straight away that this 26 and 32 are not related to the one we looked at above. So the green equals 26 words. The blue equals 32 words. Okay? So we can divide the psalm that way. Words spoken by the prophet, words spoken by God. However, if we just look at it straight, verses 1 through 4, it's 26 words. Then we have the center, which is 6 words. And then from that point on, 26 more words. And that 6-word center is kind of the pivot verse that goes with what precedes and what follows it. If you add that 6 to the 26, you get 32. So the 32 and the 26 are embedded into this psalm in 2 different ways. And so I think that Yahweh kavod formula is actually very much there. It's very present because the numbers occur in 2 totally different ways. And I think what that's saying theologically, of course, is that Yahweh's glory, his kavod, his honor, is being infringed upon. It's being violated in a sense or it's being dishonored by the failure of the Elohim to render proper justice. And so I think this is a good example of the numerical features underscoring what's plainly being stated in the text. Now, to the text itself, we begin a psalm of Asaph. God has taken his place in the divine council. And there's actually quite a bit to discuss here. I'll just try to summarize this a bit more rather than read everything out. But there are 2 questions here, fundamentally, with this verse by itself. One, does this imply some form of subordination of Yahweh? because of course it doesn't say Yahweh, but everybody basically agrees. It's one of the few things everybody agrees with is that verse 1 and 8 refer to Yahweh. Literally, he takes his stand in the Council of El, as you can see down here. So the two questions are, the fact that he stands, does that subordinate him in some way, presumably to El? Is this El's council, the high god El, the Canaanite El? And so is Yahweh pictured here as a subordinate junior member of the council? Is he the prosecutor? Because he's standing up, he's not seated, he's not the judge. Again, that's kind of how the argument goes. And then, of course, the second aspect of this phrase, of course, I just hit on, is this the divine council or is this the council of El, which it kind of literally would be? Now, Tate begins here by pointing out that the standing language isn't really that conclusive. He points to Joseph's dream. Basically, it doesn't necessarily mean any form of subordination. And he concludes, the standing of Yahweh indicates that a very important matter is being decided. So that's basically all it could mean. But as I also point out here, if we're to pay careful attention here to Yahweh's posture in verse 1, we should also take into account the last verse where Yahweh is asked to arise, God, indicating he, at some point, sat down. So he's both prosecutor and judge. And to the second point, the Council of El, this is, I think he's interacting here with Mullen, who took it as a frozen formula, as he called it, for divine council or divine assembly, borrowed from Canaanite sources. Now, I would quibble with this language of borrowed because I think it gives the wrong implication. But this is off the top of my head, so forgive me for the analogy. I could probably come up with something better if I thought about it. But what he means by frozen formula, think of, like, if I was talking with somebody and I said, when do you meet for church? When does your church meet up? And they say, we meet on Saturdays, Sunday, we have church on Wednesday, and, the college students meet on Thursday. Okay, Saturday is literally Saturn Day, the day of Saturn. Sunday is the day of the sun. Wednesday is Woden's day, that is Odin. Thursday is Thor's day. Point is, these are all deity planet names that, if we want to use the language, was borrowed. We borrowed the terminology and just brought it in. I mean, we don't think about, nobody's thinking about worshiping Saturn if they go to church on Saturday, right? We've just taken the terminology in without importing all of the baggage that goes along with it. And so that's kind of what you got going on here, at least with this argument. This argument would say that it just means divine council. It just means divine assembly. It doesn't necessarily imply El as a distinct deity from Yahweh. So that's one way of looking at it, and that might very well be what's going on. So if that's the case, then it's not an epithet for either for Yahweh or for some other deity. Two, it's not, again, as he's saying, it's not necessarily some distinct Canaanite El, and you have Yahweh here in subordination. So if the frozen formula is what's going on, it just generically means divine council, and that's usually the way everybody takes it, or many people do. However, the Greek gives an interesting trajectory to this, because we'll just bring this out. They have God stood in the assembly of the gods, and in the middle he judges the gods. There it takes it in the plural. So if you kind of reverse engineer this, you would get Council of Elohim, which is found in Ugaritic texts. So some would question whether that was the original reading. We lost the im at the end in some way, ditography or something like that. So as I conclude here, that El here is not pictured as a separate deity, distinct from Yahweh. Now, additional evidence used for that separation comes by way of the reference to the sons of Elyon in verse 6, that is, sons of the Most High. So those that would argue that Yahweh is just in the Council of El over here, this distinct deity, that the sons of Elyon are that same El, other deity. And so Yahweh is presumably one of these sons of Elyon, so Elyon isn't Yahweh, he's actually El, whatever. However, as noted by Ugaritic scholars, Canaanite El is never directly called Elyon. The title belongs to Bel. So whether we have divine council or council of El, either would be Yahweh's council. The sons of Elyon are the sons of Yahweh. What we have here is, as elsewhere, Yahweh receiving titles of both El and Bel. Yahweh is prosecutor of the Elohim and judge of the Elohim, perhaps even in a two powers in heaven hypostatic sense. Jesus will quote this psalm to defend his deity, and I would argue his pre-existence with the Father. And so I realized that was quite a bit to throw at you at the very beginning, but again, some of the kind of critical scholars, as well as like Mormonism, they're going to go in this direction. And I don't think it's really founded on very good argument, although you will come across it. So I thought it was worth the detour. Now we'll get into, again, more of verse 1. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Here, Golden Gay is interacting with the argument that these are humans, and is pointing out here, normally what's pointed to is Exodus 22:8. I'm not going to get into all of this, but it never actually says that. In fact, the ESV here just translates it as God. They shall come near to God. So they just interpret that reference to Elohim as a reference to God, not to human judges. And he says it's doubtful whether the Old Testament ever uses the word Elohim to mean human authorities, whereas it certainly uses it to mean lesser heavenly beings. Here he lists a number of verses, and there are many more we could add to that. And I would include Psalm 8 specifically. We looked at that last time. And as I continue, the concept of judgment pulses through the psalm. The term shaphat forms an inclusio. The term is used 4 times, perhaps alluding to the 4 corners of the earth. And so as you can see here, we have it beginning, and then here at the very end. And also, this is something that Labuschagne noted, is that this forms an inclusio, but part of what he calls the main inclusio is, as I put earlier, Yahweh's posture here. He stands in the council, and then at the very end, he's asked to stand, to arise, to get up. But so he stands to judge, and then his ask at the end to arise to judge. So we have this very nice inclusio beginning and ending. Now, another curiosity, and this one's, again, gets kind of deep into the weeds, but Isaiah 40 uses Psalm 82. And so I'm going to note this throughout. So while Isaiah 40 through 48 contains the so-called idol polemic, this should not be interpreted as a denial of the existence of other Elohim. And you'll often read this from people that take this like exclusive, intolerant monotheism kind of view. They'll say, at this point, Isaiah is now leveled up to monotheism. And so he's going to polemicize the pagan neighbors or even the Israelites, the previous like pre-exilic context, right? And is polemicizing the idea that the idols are nothing, like non-existence, that kind of idea. I think that takes things too far because, again, he's tracking through Psalm 82 in Isaiah 40. And then in the broader context, as I note down here, from Isaiah 40 on through the rest of Isaiah, he's really tracking on Deuteronomy 32 as well. So it takes the argument too far to say that the idol polemic is a denial that the other quote-unquote gods, the Elohim, exist. Because if you're saying that, now you're pitting parts of Scripture against Scripture. And literally, I've seen that argument. I'm thinking of Benjamin Summer here, who makes that argument that what you have, Isaiah is disagreeing with previous prophets in Scripture by doing what he's doing here. So I don't think that that's the case. So whatever Isaiah is doing in tracking in Psalm 82, I think it has to be seen in conjunction, in connection with this idea that, yes, other Elohim exist and they're judged for their lack of upholding proper justice. But anyway, continuing with what I wrote, in Isaiah, Israel is described the same way the idols are, deaf, dumb, and lifeless. Yahweh will give them life to be witnesses, which is exactly what the idols are described as unable to do in Isaiah 44:9. As you can see here, their witnesses neither see nor know that they may be put to shame, right? So he's talking about idols. The comparison reaches its climax in Isaiah 46, where Yahweh says he will carry his people, mirroring the Babylonians carrying the idols into captivity. And so really what you have here isn't so much, I don't think, Yahweh versus the idols, as much as what's happening is the idol makers are mostly what's, I think, being polemicized here. It's not the deities, it's the people worshiping those deities through their idolatry. And because there's similar terminology being used, like in Isaiah 40, specifically around verse 20 or so, where you have the people choosing wood and carving out the idol let's see, down here, right? So he chooses wood, so on and so forth. That language is what God does with Israel. He chooses Israel and he builds them, he makes them. And then here you have that nation of people is chosen. They turn around and choose blocks of wood and stone and things like that to make gods for themselves. It's craziness, the fact that they're doing this. So as I continue, scholars argue that Isaiah 40 in some ways recreates the divine council scene from Isaiah 6. Additionally, Isaiah 40 and the chapters that follow echo Deuteronomy 32, sharing themes and vocabulary. Deuteronomy 32, of course, connects to Psalm 82, where the sons of God are given authority over the nations outside of Israel. Isaiah's idol polemic should not be seen as a denial of the existence of other Elohim, as both Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82 affirm their existence. Rather, it critiques the foolishness of idolizing the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. And I borrow that phrase from Paul. The very reason they are doomed to pass away is given to us in this very psalm. And so this is the beginning of our comparisons here. But Isaiah 40:23, you have this line here that the Lord here in context brings the rulers of the earth to emptiness or to nothingness. And this, again, it could literally be rendered judges. But we will continue and we'll note where Isaiah is tracking through Psalm 82. But here is kind of the crux of everything that went wrong, especially over against Deuteronomy 32, where God puts the nations under control of under the rule of the sons of God. These divine creatures. Of course, you look at that in the Greek, the angels of God. This is well known. I mean, the early church fathers talk about this exact concept. But moving on, in fact, I don't want to just move past that. I do want to do it. So in verse 8, he fixed the borders of the people, and this is the Most High, remember, Elyon, according to the number of the sons of God. So the Lord puts these nations under the control, under the rule of, and of course it doesn't have it here because this is running with the MT here. But if we were to look at this in the Greek, we get the Most High distributed the nations. He scattered the descendants of Adam. He set up boundaries for the nations according to the number of the angels of God. But here we have a number of early church fathers that are going to echo this idea, of course, because they get it in their Greek version. Yet in Deuteronomy, we observe that God told these things, and that God said, where it is written, when he scattered abroad the children of Adam, he determined the bounds of the nations according to the number of the angels of God. We have another one here, Severian of Gabala. It is therefore the task of each angel to defend the distinction of nations. Pseudo Dionysius. Michael is called the ruler of the Jewish people. The other angels are described as rulers of other nations. For the Most High has established the boundaries of the nations by the number of his angels. Jerome, commenting on Daniel 10, says the same thing. These are the princes of whom Paul also says, so on and so forth. But again, he quotes here Deuteronomy that has this idea of a territorial prince over the places. Theodoret, same thing. He's actually talking about, this is interesting because he kind of has the hierarchy thing where he's talking about angels, like the guardian angel idea, how they see the face of the Father. But the archangels are entrusted with authority over nations. And here he talks about Daniel, again, the prince of Persia, prince of Greece, the prince of Israel, all of that stuff. So this is very well-known stuff. This wouldn't have surprised an ancient Israelite or an ancient or early Christian commentator. They would have been very well aware of this stuff, this idea of these sons of God being put over the nations. But here's what they do wrong. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the rights of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. So the misrule by the sons of the Most High in the heavens has earthly ramifications, as Golden Gay and Mullen note. And so while this has earthly consequences, it's part of a heavenly reality that's going on. So as Golden Gay says in his Psalms commentary, The gods are expected to identify with the principles that Yahweh believes in and expects human beings to live by. The presupposition is that the gods share in responsibility for the proper supervision of life in the world under God, but above earthly authorities. Compare the critique of Carrot and the legend of King Carrot. And then Mullen similarly says, the crux of the interpretation of the psalm revolves around verses 2 through 4. And in the broader context, I think it's down here, but he's interacting with somebody else who was saying that verses 2 through 4 were like a later addition to the psalm, and is saying that they're actually crucial to understanding the psalm, and is pointing out that this is a well-known ancient concept. He says, as we have seen, and this is earlier in his book, this task was specifically given to the members of the divine council. In Deuteronomy 33:3, the holy ones are called specifically the guardians of the peoples. It is their task to administer justice rightly. Likewise, Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, he lists some other passages, reveals that the various nations were placed under the rule of other gods, the B'nai Elohim, while Israel was Yahweh's portion and inheritance. By the way, I can't help but point this out because this is funny to me. Well, let me finish the thought and then we'll go back to this. By the principle like is like, if failure to govern properly, especially in regard to the dispensation of justice, constituted reason for removal of the earthly king, then it would also justify the condemnation of the divine rulers of various nations. The Canaanite parallels make this clear. What's funny to me is here he lists this passage in Deuteronomy 33:3, which I was kind of laughing at when I got to this point, because here, this is the ESV. It says, and this is right after the tens of thousands of the holy ones and all that stuff. It gets really weird. There's a lot of weird stuff. But he says, yes, he beloved his people. And notice that there are footnotes all over this part because it's very difficult. All his holy ones were in his hand, so they followed in your steps, receiving direction from you. You can't see this, I don't think, but the footnote here in 5 says, the meaning of the Hebrew word is uncertain. And what's funny is I have this source here, Mullen, that I got from the Divine Council bibliography from Heiser. I bought into that, and if you paid for it, you'll get access to the bibliography. So you get access to all these articles, and in some cases, entire books. And so I bought into it. I'm pretty sure that's where I got this. It would have to be where I got this. But what's funny is some of these books are like scans, and so you'll actually see like highlights and little notes in the margins and stuff like that. I assume that's Heiser. And in this particular passage, there's like a question mark next to this part, and I'm sure he's thinking, like, where did he get this exactly? This translation, guardians of the peoples, because it's this line right here that it's talking about. So they followed in your steps. Very interpretive, but I'm not really sure. But again, nobody knows exactly how to translate that. Now, it makes sense thematically, but it is a little bit like, I don't know where he got that. Like elsewhere, we're going to get to another of Mullen's almost idiosyncratic kind of translations, but that one is very well argued for. And so we're going to get to some interesting stuff there, but I couldn't help but point that out because it's like, I'm not really sure where he got that, and I need to look because it might be in that book itself. He might actually defend it somewhere else, but yeah, nobody really knows what to do here. The other translations, again, everybody's all over the place there. But continuing, this is also from Mullen later on in his commentary. He says, likewise, a consideration of verses 2 through 4 fails to convince one that they deal with human and not divine judges. This is kind of funny because there are those that would look at this and say that this is very human, earthly activity, right? So obviously we're dealing with human judges. And he's saying, no, the precise opposite is the case. As we have seen, and again, earlier in the book, it is precisely the divine beings who were responsible for the dispensation of justice. Compare the Ugaritic to Pitu Naharu, Judge River, who are condemned. Like any earthly king who did not fulfill this function, they were unworthy of rule. The Hebrew and Ugaritic evidence both point to the originality of verses 2 through 4 in Psalm 82. So he's saying, and other commentators as well were saying, this really is very, very important. What they're failing to do. The Elohim here, the sons of the Most High, they're failing to take care of the poor, the needy, the weak, the fatherless. And of course, mirroring that is, for instance, the Pharaoh or whoever is over that geographical place. They're mirroring that injustice on earth. They're not guiding, they're not shepherding the people to the way that Yahweh would have them act. And so it's for this reason that they're being removed. Now we get to the kind of the center of the psalm here. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. And here, once again, we get in Isaiah 20b and verse 21, we have some of the same language used. But what's interesting is it's actually using it in a very different way. Like he doesn't mean the same thing, but he's using the same vocabulary. Again, it's like it's obvious he's tracking on Psalm 82, even though he's kind of doing things differently. So, for instance, here he talks about how they choose wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skillful craftsman to set up an idol that will not move. And this word here is what we get here with the foundations of the earth. Probably a more literal translation is totter, right? So the foundations are tottering. And so he wants to set up an idol here that will not totter, that will not wobble. And similarly, here in the next verse, this is very interesting. He's saying to the people, that is Yahweh saying, do you not know? As you can see over here, they have neither knowledge. Do you not hear? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood? Again, they have neither understanding from the foundations of the earth. So you have exactly the same phrase here, the foundations of the earth, but he means it here in Isaiah in a creation context. That is from creation. Have you not known from the beginning? You know, that kind of idea. But here, because of the injustice of the Elohim, the foundations of the earth are tottering, they're shaking. The stability, again, because they've not upheld the stability. These are pillars of earthly rule, are watching out for the weak and things like that, and they've not upheld that, and as a result, the very foundations of the earth are tottering and shaking. But continuing on, also of note, again, this language here, they walk about in darkness. As I point out, Job 2:2 and Zechariah 1:10-11 both describe divine creatures walking/patrolling the earth and reporting back to Yahweh. So again, nobody doubts that the meeting in Job 1 and 2 is happening in the heavens, right? The council, the sons of God are going to meet God in the heavens. Of course, in Job, we have the Satan, Hasatan, comes along with them. And so the Lord asks him, where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. As you can see, it's the same language that we get here. And then I also noted here Zechariah, and this is the horsemen, right? We have these patrolling horsemen, and these horsemen are whom the Lord sent to patrol the earth. And they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, we have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth remains at rest. As you can see here, it's the same terminology. So we have precedents for this kind of language, and this will come up again here in a moment, but the phrase, they have neither knowledge, specifically that part of the phrase, may connect back to Genesis 3, which contains the first use of the term yada, meaning to know. Genesis 3:5 says, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So this is what the serpent tempts Adam and Eve with, is this knowledge. Of course, when they eventually eat of the fruit, the knowledge they have, what they know, is not this divine heavenly knowledge. They don't become gods in the ultimate sense they were hoping. They what they know is their nakedness. What they know is shame. So there's this intense, bitter disappointment and irony in that. But as I continue here, the term yada is quite common, appearing nearly 1,000 times in the Old Testament. So, it's, to be fair, it's very common terminology. However, the next two verses, especially verse 7 in our psalm, may point back to Genesis 3, making this verbal echo plausible. So we'll return to this idea, and I round this out with Anderson here. I think that's Francis Anderson, argued that the foundations of the earth referred to the abode of the dead in Sheol. The upper region of the netherworld would be the same as the foundations of the world in a three-tier cosmology. So imagine a house, right? So you have the normal first floor, your normal living area. You have an attic upstairs, right? That'd be kind of like heaven. And then beneath it, you have the basement, which would be like the underworld, right? So if there's a party going on in the basement and it's like shaking the floor of the living room, that's the ceiling of the basement, right? So it's that same dividing structure. And so that actually kind of does make sense thematically. And there's a lot of interesting things going on here. So maybe, but I put that one on the more doubtful side, but that is an interesting suggestion. Again, you might want to keep that in mind, because as we move forward, you might think, actually, that might make a lot of sense with what follows. So we get to verse 6, and this is actually what Jesus quotes in John 10. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Now, there's debate over how this here rendered as I said should be translated. Some opt for I thought. And so Tate comments contra that idea. He says in Jeremiah 3:19-20, it is doubtful that Yahweh only thinks the content of verse 19, though it is quite possible that, I thought, I said, here means I intended. So that does, the idea of I thought does, it is carried in, the same semantic range, but some don't like it because it's kind of this extreme anthropomorphism. Did he not know these things really? And so some would take it as, again, like this extreme irony. And I don't think that's the case. I think what's going on here is what he said, because I think I intended makes a lot of sense. So here in Jeremiah, I think it's actually a very good parallel, even thematically, what's going on. He said, this is God speaking, I said I would set you among my sons and give you a pleasant land, so on and so forth. I thought you would call me my father. But again, if we go with what was suggested with intended, he's saying here in this context of Jeremiah, I intended you to be my sons. I intended for you to call me my father. And I think similarly, if we take that idea, I say, well, perhaps not literal, understanding the pronoun verb as I intended in verse 6 makes sense. Taken this way, Yahweh is saying he intended the heavenly rulers to be gods and his sons. Their failures are recalled in verses 2-4, and their punishment follows in the next verse. And in fact, this right here, I don't think I have it in my notes here, the nevertheless, I think it's Tate. He, again, nevertheless works. There's a number of ways that this is translated, but in this kind of context, he goes with but no, right? So it's I intended you to be gods, rulers. I intended you to be my sons, but no. Like a man, you shall die and fall like any prince. And this is Adam, and this is, what is this? Sarim, right? Very interesting. The preposition like plus Adam, ki Adam, is used only 2 other times in the Hebrew Old Testament. So Hosea 6:7, you have, but like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me. As you can see here, it's the same preposition. And then also we have Job 31:33, which is obscured by the ESV here. It says, if I have concealed my transgression as others do by hiding my iniquity in my heart. Literally, it's like Adam. If I have concealed my transgressions like Adam by hiding iniquity in my heart. So as I conclude here, what these passages have in common is the narrative of the fall. Hosea addresses Adam's transgression. Job focuses on Adam's attempt to conceal his transgression. And the psalm here deals with Adam's punishment for that transgression. And Tate here is interacting with Mullen. Mullen wrote that, or he argued that Adam here in this colon refers to the biblical Adam in Genesis 2:3, who rebelled against God by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which carried the penalty of death. Again, note the knowledge of good and evil. For his transgression, Adam was driven from the garden. This may be correct and would be an interesting reference to Genesis 2-3, which is generally ignored in the rest of the Old Testament. The meaning would differ little, if any, from the usual assumption that Adam refers to humanity. Now, as I write here, I agree. the meaning of this line wouldn't significantly change on either translation. So die like Adam, die like a man, really doesn't matter too much for that line. However, it might change our understanding of the next line, and fall like any prince. So as I write here, Hebrew poetry rhymes in thought or concept, not sound. Commentators have wondered in what sense to die like Adam connects to fall like a prince. And there's a lot of suggestions made, and none of them really connect. Again, how exactly does dying like a man mirror or connect to falling like a prince? It just doesn't really connect as well as you would like, and there really isn't a satisfactory answer. Now, as I continue, we should recall our potential connection in verse 5 to Genesis 3 by way of the term yada, knowledge. What the serpent tempts Adam and Eve with is what the gods are found lacking, knowledge. Elsewhere, the knowledge of good and evil is connected with judicial rule, precisely what the Elohim are tasked with. Adam attempts to take authority for himself and is banished from the garden and left to his mortal fate outside the direct presence of God. With these details in mind, we turn to Mullen, who proposes an interesting trajectory for the language behind prince. Now, buckle up, this is going to get kind of intense here. So Mullen writes, reflexes of the revolt of the gods, or the Elohim, against the high God and their expulsion from heaven are reflected in both Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. In Isaiah 14, we read, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Hallel ben Shahar." The reason behind the expulsion of Hallel ben Shahar, Shining One, Day Star, Son of Dawn, is explicitly stated in verses 13 and 14. So in here, Hallel aspired to place himself above the stars of God here in English, but that's El, above the stars of El, and to sit enthroned in the mount of assembly of the gods, to be like Elyon, to be like the Most High. So a lot of connecting language here. The name Hallel means literally shining one. The LXX, the Greek, translates the morning star, the one that rises in the morning, i.e. Venus. The Vulgate, of course, rendered that Lucifer, light bringer, Venus, that the Venus star should be identified as the son of Sahar, dawn, would be expected in mythological thought. The Ugaritic texts provide further evidence of such an Elohim called the Shining One, apart from the Elohim Saru. In CTA 23, the birth of the gracious gods Sahar, dawn, and Salimu, dusk, we find an interesting tricolon. Mot, death, and Shining One sits enthroned. In his hand, the scepter of bereavement. In his hand, the staff of widowhood. We take Sar to be part of a double name, common to the Ugaritic text, meaning shining one. Compare Akkadian Sararu, to be brilliant, to shine. Compare also Arabic Sarar, sparkling. Such an epithet would provide a perfect parallel to Hallel, Lucifer, in Isaiah 14:12. Interestingly, the Elohim Hallel, the Shining One, is cast into the underworld, Sheol, precisely the realm of the god Mot in Ugaritic literature. In CTA 2357, we also have reference to Sari Puri, the Shining Ones of the Council, that these gods, presumably the forces of chaos and death, constitute an assembly should occasion no surprise. And in following this discussion, Mullen then proposes that verse 7b should be translated, "And like one of the shining ones, you shall fall." So let's take a look at all of this that we've looked at here, verses 6 and 7. So again, we have something more like, I intended you to be gods. I intended you to be sons of the Most High, all of you. But no, like Adam, you will die. Remember Adam, dying, you will die, right? So like Adam, you will die and fall like one of the shining ones. So if the previous line referring to the first man's fate of mortality, if that's what's going on here, the fate of being cast down from heaven would constitute a perfect parallel. So this would answer, how does dying like Adam mirror falling like a prince? Well, maybe it's not necessarily prince. Maybe it's shining one or something to that effect. So do we have a reference back to Genesis 3 here? I don't know, maybe. I lean in that direction for sure. Now, to round this out, concerning the death of the Elohim, Tate writes, a god could be killed if he became rebellious and failed to carry out his functions, as for example in Enuma Elish and Atrahasis. Now, what's interesting, and I think I lost part of the quote. I don't know what happened to it. I know he ends up saying something about how this is unparalleled, though. For one Elohim to render a group of Elohim mortal, to condemn them all to death, is without parallel. And that's important because we never really have, and I think I feel confident saying we never have in the Bible them, the Israelite authors, just going Control-C, Control-V, copy and pasting pagan material and thought and text and whatever ideas, concepts, titles, just directly, doing nothing, just copy and paste. It's always interacting with it in some way. It's polemicizing it. It's disagreeing with it. It's saying you're right in this narrow sense, but wrong overall, that kind of thing. And so we do have precedents for one Elohim to fire a single other Elohim. You did a bad job, you're fired. But this is one Elohim, Yahweh, firing the entire cabinet, firing the entire government, rendering them all mortal. It's an extreme case. You never have anything like this because there is no God like Yahweh. So he does things that none of them do. And so you never have the pagan material brought in just directly. It's always being interacted with. And I think that's important to note. When we get into all of this stuff, all the Ugaritic material and Mesopotamian stuff, it's always being interacted with in some way. It's being used, but it's being used to do something. It's not just being brought directly over in. Nobody's making that argument. So anyway, we'll close out here with the last verse. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all nations. We should remember that this is a psalm Jesus quotes to defend his deity. As Hamilton notes, Jesus makes statements that presume his pre-existence with the Father in heaven, relating that the Father sanctified him and sent him into the world. John 10:36. So in that same context, he quotes this. The quotation from verse 6 in this reading provides the heavenly context, the court from which Jesus was sent. In that circle of heavenly beings, these other divine authorities were addressed by God as gods, Elohim, and named sons of the Most High, as God gave them authority over the nations. Again, Deuteronomy 32 and all these other passages. Jesus comes as the one in whom God will inherit the nations. Verse 8, as well as Psalm 2:8, very messianic psalm. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus has just claimed to be one with the Father. Jesus does not defend himself against the charge of blasphemy on the basis of his likeness to other humans, but on the basis of his unique relationship with the Father and unique role in God's plan. Hamilton's discussion of John 10 and Psalm 82 is very good. I can't recommend his Psalms commentary high enough. He's very reformed, Calvinistic, and so I disagree with those areas anytime it gets into that kind of thing. But overall, one of the best commentaries I've read on any book, period. But as I continue here, when Jesus is pressed to defend his claim of deity, he cites not just a text that affirms the existence of other Elohim, but a text he himself appears as judge of the Elohim. Jesus is not merely a son of the Most High. He is the only begotten Son from all eternity. In the last verse, Asaph calls on God to arise, judge, and reclaim the nations. Let me go ahead and get this ready. The Greek renders this verse, stand up, O God, judge the earth, because you will inherit all nations. So this is what I'm referring to here. The Greek term here, this anastami, is one of our resurrection terms in the New Testament. How does Yahweh judge the corrupt Elohim and reclaim the nations? Through the resurrection of Christ. Jesus' argument in John 10 suggests his pre-existence in the divine council, from where he was sent to redeem humanity, a role contrasting with the judged powers in Psalm 82. So Jesus is sent on a rescue mission to restore humanity, restore tree of life kind of idea. He's giving all those that believe, John 3:16, eternal life, everlasting life. He's going to give humanity back immortality. But the flip side of that is what? As we get adopted as sons and daughters of God into immortality. The current sons of God are condemned to mortality, right? So there's this grand reversal as Jesus is sent from the council into the world. And we'll close it off here with Isaiah, again, who's been tracking on Psalm 82. And this is one's really interesting. He says, this is verse 17, all the nations are as nothing before him. They're accounted by him as less than nothing in emptiness. So this last line here, Isaiah uses the final words of this psalm, inherit, all the nations, right? He uses these words to describe the nations, which may seem fearsome, but are less than nothing in comparison. Yet Christ himself will die to reclaim these less than nothing nations. And in his resurrection and sending of the Spirit, the project of reclaiming the nations has begun. And so, as has been the case through all of these Psalms that we've gone through, Jesus is very much the pivotal point in all of these Psalms. And I would also argue, through many of these Psalms, I've been going back repeatedly to Genesis 3. That comes up a lot as well. The promise of the eventual reversal of the fall. So we have the fall, the promise of that reversal, and then all that leads forward to Christ. And we get all of that, I think, in Psalm 82 as well. Which, by the way, a lot of these observations kind of evaporate if we go with the quote-unquote human view of Psalm 82. It just doesn't work. I don't want to belabor the point and go through how those arguments don't work. Specifically, again, I intended this to be more of a positive presentation in the sense of I'm going to assume the interpretation, defend it, or just, in a sense, teach it, if you will. And I think it defends itself. And the way Jesus uses it makes a lot of sense. I think it makes far more sense that Jesus is quoting this psalm, assuming that they are divine creatures. These are heavenly creatures, not humans. Because, yes, the argument goes from the lesser to the greater on both views, but I feel like the argument, the human view of Psalm 82, renders Jesus' point almost equivocation. It's kind of a semantic argument Jesus is making. He doesn't defend his deity by quoting Psalm 82. He then turns around and equates himself with the Father. Yes, so ultimately he does defend his deity. But I think he's doing it by way of Psalm 82 as well. He's saying, our own scripture here says that there are other Elohim. So if I'm making myself out to be a god, our own scripture affirms that. To which they would have to nod their head. Okay, sure. I feel like they're kind of, loosening their grip on the rocks that they were getting ready to stone him with. And then when he ups it by saying, oh, by the way, I'm the Elohim of Elohim. I'm the God of that council of gods. That's where they grip the stones even tighter. They pick them back up, right? They're ready to stone him for that. But I think that's about all for this time, and I will see you guys later. Be sure to check out the Ko-Fi. I put a link in the description, and you can download the notes on Ko-Fi, but I will see you guys later.